Hello, you are listening to the Natural Healing Show for UK Health Radio. I'm your host, Catherine Carrigan, medical intuitive healer and Amazon #1 bestselling author. You can find out more about me and my work at catherinecarrigan.com and unlimitedenergynow.com. While you're there, sign up for my newsletter so you can learn even more about how you can be healthy naturally. Now, our guest today is Ryan Glatt. Ryan is a brain health coach. You can find out more about Ryan and his excellent work at ryanglatt.com. That's RYANGLATT.com and somatic.co. That's SOMATIQ.co. Welcome, Ryan Glatt.
Thank you, Catherine.
Now, Ryan, what exactly is brain health?
That's a great question. So brain health can be viewed as a parallel to bodily health. So most people know what it takes to have a healthy body. They think about diet, they think about sleep, they think about exercise, mostly for bodily or physical outcomes. But what I'm trying to get out into the general public is this concept of brain health, where as you would work on your body every day, you also want to work on your brain every day, not specifically for one problem, but for general health. And so brain health generally refers to the optimization or regulation of cognitive or mental functions, as well as psychological health. And so just like people go to the gym, there's things that you can do daily for your brain. Just like you take care of your body through nutrition, you can focus on the brain through nutrition. Just like you sleep for physical outcomes, you can also sleep for mental outcomes. And so a lot of the interventions are relatively the same. They're just geared and targeted towards an outcome associated with the brain.
Now, we are talking about one of my personal favorite subjects because my first 10 years as a healer, and I've been practicing natural healing full-time for 25 years. My first 10 years, I was studying and practicing healing specifically for the brain. And 2 of my 8 books are about how to heal depression without drugs and how to heal the brain. And my book, unlimitedenergynow.com, also talks about the brain. And one of my favorite people to listen to is Dr. Daniel Amen, author of many books about brain health. And I know we have both studied with Dr. Amen. And I remember one time listening to Dr. Amen, and he talked about if you do MRIs of thousands of brains, pretty much nobody has a normal brain. What do you think about that?
Yeah, well, in my studies with Dr. Amen, he showed a lot of those SPECT scans showing blood flow and how different parts of the brain might be active based on that blood flow. And I think it's interesting to say that, and it's also not surprising to understand this concept of bio-individuality, that everyone's an individual. And that normal definitely just means normative relative to the other parts of a population. And so this whole idea of comparing ourselves to others in terms of our physical health, which is easy to do with our physicality, our aesthetics, and that causes all sorts of issues, as we know, in our society, but also compare ourselves to each other's brain health, that's probably not the best way to go. Now, we need normative values, average population-based values for research, for recommendations, to show normal values. But generally in a coaching context, and especially when someone's seeking optimal brain health, we want to consider the individual. And that's something beautiful that Dr. Amen would do, is he would use a scan and create an individualized plan. And so I'm not using SPECT scans, although that's a tool that can be used as a referral mechanism. But we're really just looking at the bio-individuality, both from a physiological standpoint and a behavioral standpoint. So I think it's beautiful that is true. There's no normal relative to the individual. Everyone has their own individual needs.
Yeah, and I would totally agree with what you're saying. When I started studying the brain, we looked at brain organization profiles. So what do I mean by that? So just like you're either right-handed or left-handed, you also have a dominant brain hemisphere. So you're either right brain dominant or left brain dominant. And then you also have a dominant eye, a dominant ear, a dominant hand, and a dominant foot. And under stress, your non-dominant hemisphere is 75 to 85% shut down. So when you do brain integration work, and I'm sure Ryan's going to talk about brain health exercises. When you do exercises to optimize your brain function, you can turn on parts of your brain that are frequently shut down when you're stressed. And so from my work, there's 54 possible brain organization profiles. And so that really accounts, in my view, for a lot of the difficulties that we have as humans and even communicating with each other, because each of us literally sees the world in a very unique way. And of course, my way is the best way, and Ryan would argue that his way is the best way. And it's sometimes when you understand brain profiles, you go, it's a miracle that we can even communicate with each other.
Yeah, I mean, it's a pretty complex set of systems. And one of my favorite fields that are emerging is one called embodied cognition or embodied neuroscience, where people are going crazy thinking about how important the gut is relative to brain health and calling it the brain or the second brain. But really, all parts of the body, all organ systems are very intelligent, and so is the brain. So it's not that one is in charge of the other, or one I think we see characteristics in certain organ systems, the brain included, and we like to make gross assumptions, this equals that. And I think that's interesting, but I also think as a self-organizing, complex biological system, we can't make those recommendations right off the cuff. But we can definitely look at various factors, the ones that are body-based, the ones that are brain-based, and the ones that are environment-based. We can tweak all those factors in each of those domains for optimal brain health.
And you know, you're bringing up some really important subjects that we here at the Natural Healing Show talk about. So let's talk about gut health to start. One thing I know a lot of people don't know is that over 90% of your serotonin is produced in your GI tract. So if you've got chronically upset GI tract from eating a poor diet or having parasites or other infections in your gut, then your brain chemistry is not going to work right. And yet you also talked about environmental health, so all our environmental toxins. So Brian, what mistakes do you see people making trying to achieve better brain health?
Yeah, the mistakes I see people making are very much the same mistakes as they make with bodily health, and that is looking for the silver bullet. And so some people might think gut health is the silver bullet. Some people might think environmental toxins are the silver bullet, and they may certainly contribute to brain health. And I think a lot of research is popping up showing that it does. And so people will hear about this stuff in the mainstream media and then start to focus only on that when they may not be sleeping well. And that is kind of the one thing you should be focusing on at that moment in time, if that's true for you. Or maybe the one thing you can control every day is how much you're active and what kinds of exercise modalities you're participating in. And that might be more beneficial or more impactful on your brain health than other things. And so it's not really saying what's more important than the other, but it is saying what's more important relative to the individual. So kind of bringing back that concept of bioindividuality. One thing might be more important for one person than another person. And so environmental toxins might be huge for you. It might have changed your life, or gut health might have changed your life. But for you, you might need sleep or variability in your exercise routines. And so we really want to look at the individual and think about what is most necessary for the biggest impact. And so one thing that we do is we look at what's going on with the body. So look at the positives and look at the negatives. What's good about what you're doing with your body and what's bad about what you're doing with your body. And you'll know, it's common sense. And then look at your brain, and you can look at mindset, you can look at psychology, heck, you could even look at genetics. You could look at, are you brain foggy? Do you like that? Are you really alert at 12 p.m. sharp every day, and that allows you to get work done? What do you like and what you don't like about your brain function, your psychology? And then you can look at your environment, your work environment, your home environment, your personal relationships, your social relationships, and start to look at what's positive and negative about that. And so if you took all the negatives from each of those categories, what's the biggest one that jumps out to you that if you picked that one and you could confidently say if that was now a positive, that would make a significant impact on your brain health, that's the one you probably want to focus on.
You know, Ryan Glatt, I really love what you're talking about, because you're literally talking about a holistic approach.
That's right. Yeah.
Because there's so many factors that affect our brain health. And, you know, we're talking about mistakes people make. so many people, when they don't feel well, they have depression or anxiety or other brain disorders, the first thing they do is they go to their medical doctor and look for a pill for a medication, a psychiatric medication. Now, I want to emphasize that if you're listening and if you're taking any form of medication, we're not judging you. We have compassion. What Ryan and I are talking about is a bigger picture and maybe information that you haven't considered that may make a big impact and may possibly empower you so that those medications no longer become necessary. But when you're working with clients who are on medications, what do you advise them?
Well, typically the clients that I've worked with that are on medications are usually referred to me by a psychologist or a cognitive behavioral therapist. And so they're already getting some sort of therapy, and it's typically outside my scope to discuss medications, discuss psychology from a very therapeutic level with them. And so usually they'll be referred to me by someone who is working with them on a mental health professional level. And what I do is I work with their lifestyle. And so, for example, I had an individual that was depressed. And so that individual was not doing very much with their exercise and was not sleeping very well. And the therapy had been going on for about 6 months, a little bit longer than they would have liked, but the therapy was crucial in their recovery from depression. And so what I tried to do is instill some behaviors that got them to participate in aerobic exercise, in which aerobic exercise is very well researched in improving mental function, overcoming fatigue, helping with depressive symptoms. And so just getting him to exercise probably 10 to 20 minutes a day aerobically over a period of about 2 weeks really changed the tide in terms of his depression. And the reason we focused on exercise is because it releases a bunch of neurochemicals that can actually help with sleep. And so indirectly, we positively impact his sleep. And once you start sleeping better, then you also start to get better from that perspective. You start to almost wash the brain of all these toxins. The lymphatic system, which is the lymphatic system plus the glial cells in your brain, start to get massaged and washed and cleaned up a little bit. And so all these different neurochemical cascades are occurring from multiple angles that allowed him to empower his neurochemistry, but also empower his psychology, and in combination with the therapy, overcome that depression. But there was a point at that stage where he was reliant on medication and probably needed it from one extent to get to where he needed to be now. And so now he's completely out of therapy, off medication, but that's one example of how we might integrate with that. And while medication is always a last resort or something you want to consider before just diving into it, some people can find it helpful and sometimes it's necessary, but most of the time we're looking for a natural remedy, and the sleep and exercise recommendations were free and they were low cost and they weren't easy per se, but it required a behavior change to incorporate them because the research is there on these lifestyle interventions. In fact, there's a field called nutritional psychiatry that's coming out where people are using nutrition specifically for different mental conditions. And I kind of do the same thing more from an exercise approach. And so Dr. Amen has talked about using different types of exercise for different types of ADHD or different types of anxiety, depression. And I sort of side with that approach.
Now, 2 of my 8 books are about how to heal depression without drugs. My most recent book, Banish the Blues Now, talks about natural healing for the brain and natural healing for depression and anxiety. And, you know, unfortunately, I believe in the US, something like 12% of US adults are on antidepressant drugs. So people like Ryan and myself, we want to empower you so that you understand what you can do to feel better naturally. Now let's talk about exercise, because Ryan, you talked about different exercises for different conditions. How can exercise benefit the brain, and what specific kinds of exercise do you recommend for specific conditions?
Sure. So when it comes to exercise in the brain, there's a great book called Spark by Dr. John Rady, who kind of popularized the concepts of why exercise and how exercise is beneficial to the brain. And so that book is called Spark. It's very, very good in terms of giving lots of examples of anxiety, depression, ADHD, and how exercise has transformed the lives in those cases of those people. And so the gist of exercise and its effect on the brain, I mean, it's hard to give a gist because there's so many events that are occurring. The first one is neurogenesis. It's literally the creation of new neurons in the brain. And so new nerve tissue that allows your brain to grow and enter a phase of change called neuroplasticity. In addition, there's something called angiogenesis, which is the creation of new blood vessels. And so as you're pumping more blood, the brain wants to meet that demand and starts to create new blood vessels, just as it would in your body for more muscle mass, or it would adapt to a stimulus. And so those are two main physical mechanisms that are occurring. Your brain's structure is literally changing with new neurons, new blood vessels. It's pretty amazing. And so with that comes a lot of physiological benefits that are really positive that can impact any condition. So as I might go into specific exercise modalities, really what I want to push is that any physical activity is beneficial for the brain because it's following along those mechanisms. In addition, you're releasing positive neurochemicals like dopamine and serotonin that can really help with mental health as well as general health. And just day-to-day psychology for a general health outcome. And then you're also looking at what's called, like I said earlier, neuroplasticity, specifically in an area of the brain called the hippocampus, responsible for learning and memory. So they've literally seen an increase in size of this part of your brain responsible for learning and memory. And so that's pretty amazing that you can literally grow your brain. So if I told you there was a pill that you could take for immediately more blood vessels, more neurons, brain size, brain function, and happiness, you'd say how much, because that sounds like an amazing pill, and that pill is exercise. And so there's the last thing that I want to say about the mechanisms, unless we want to go deeper into it, is there's this molecule, this chemical called BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, that Dr. John Ratey calls miracle grow for the brain. And so there's all these different things coming together that just by exercising, your brain starts to grow, the function starts to get better, the synapses start to fire faster and more efficiently. There's something called myelin, which is like this covering around the neurons that start to make those electrical connections and communications more efficient. And so there's all these amazing things occurring with exercise. Now, the most important, or rather, I guess I should say the most popular mechanism of exercise or modality is aerobic exercise. And that's what's been studied the most because it's easiest to control. You can put an animal or a human on a treadmill. It's very easy to control for. But if I told you the only option for you is just to go on a treadmill, you probably wouldn't be very happy with that because there's not a lot of options. And so really my message for physical activity is variability. And what I mean by variability is have you heard of the concept that variety is the spice of life, or the key to a good diet is variety? So this principle is also true for exercise. So if you mix a multitude of modalities, you mix yoga with Tai Chi, with running, with weightlifting, with stretching, with boot camps and high intensity interval training and walking and hiking, as well as, hobbies like playing a sport or doing some garden work, something like that, or working around the house. All these activities are good for the brain. All these activities are great. And what you don't want to do is bias just towards one. If you can't afford the mental energy to do so, put effort into having a variety of mixed modalities. And that's ultimately what will benefit your brain the most.
Now, I just really love this message, Ryan. And I want to add some other additional information. Duke University did a study some years ago, and they divided a group of people into 3 groups: a group who took antidepressants, a group who did nothing, and a group who took 4 groups, I believe: antidepressants and exercise, group who did nothing, and a group who did exercise alone. And short-term exercise and antidepressants are equally effective. But long-term exercise alone is more effective for treating depression than antidepressants or antidepressants in exercise.
Yeah, so, the neurochemical cocktail, if you will, that's released during exercise, some have paralleled to the positive effects of morphine. Now, it doesn't mean you're going to run and just feel nothing like you would if you had morphine, but there's pain-relieving neurochemicals, there's antidepressant chemicals that are released. It's pretty amazing what exercise can do.
So that's really a great positive message, that exercise alone, long-term, is more effective for treating depression than antidepressants or antidepressants in exercise. Second thing is when you practice yoga, which I teach and I've taught for 23 years, you raise your own levels of GABA, gamma-aminobutyric acid. And when you're low in GABA, you're anxious. So practicing yoga definitely will have the benefits of all other exercise, but it also reduces your anxiety levels very significantly.
It certainly can. And I think that's a great segue into different conditions or different people. What types of exercise should we be doing? And we can give some general rules of thumb without being too specific or having to talk about diagnoses, because that's kind of a more specific conversation that I'd rather have with an individual. But if basically you're looking at different types of exercise, there's aerobic training where you're getting your heart rate up, and there's two types of aerobic training. There's interval training, and this is popular from high intensity interval training. And then there's steady state training where you're going to walk or run or lift weights or do something at a specific heart rate level and kind of stay there. And so those are two different types of aerobic training. And then you can be high intensity, you can be low intensity in both of those categories. For strength training, there's not just linear weightlifting, which is when people think of resistance training, think of bicep curls, shoulder presses. That's beneficial for executive function, for cognitive function. But there's also different types of loaded exercises like loaded movement training, where I'm going to move in a lot of unconventional movement patterns or three-dimensional movement patterns with a weight. And so if you think of dance in the directions I might move in dance, you're going to have a rhythm and timing, although it might not be as fast because you have a load, but you're moving in multiple directions. Then there's other things like dance, capoeira, martial arts, things that require a choreography, a memorization of some sort of moves, and you have to embody and then smoothly coordinate those movements. And so there's processes of your coordination, your memory processes that are involved in doing that. And then we have things like mindful movement, the things like yoga, tai chi, qigong. And so when we look at all those categories, there's a lot of different options there. Now, if you're struggling with something like anxiety, just like the study you quoted, anything mindful movement oriented is going to help you. And so that can include yoga, tai chi, qigong. But let's say you don't want to do any of those things, or those things aren't for you, then you could just incorporate a posture. Let's say it's a sitting posture where you're on one knee and you're keeping a nice tall posture, just taking deep breaths at the end of your workout, whatever your workout is. So in yoga, you're in a posture, you're being mindful of your breath, and you're holding that posture typically for a certain amount of time before moving in and out of other postures. And so yoga is a system that we can study, and that's why it's more in the research than what I'm talking about. But there's also something called restorative poses, where you can just get in a posture or in a stretch and hold it and breathe and be mindful, and theoretically you would get the same benefits. The same is true for any sort of dance class. I love the concept of dance, but it's a little stigmatized for people my age and my gender. And I don't have a lot of access to dance that in an environment where I'd feel really comfortable. So what I do is I get my choreography in my weight training, where I'll do these different lunge patterns or squat patterns that are all different. And I do them with a weight. So I'm getting my resistance training, but there's choreography. And I have 4 moves that I string together in a row, and I would call that a loaded flow, a loaded movement flow. And so then I'm getting the benefits of dance with the benefits of resistance training. And that is one example of how I might incorporate multiple modalities into one. And the reason I might do that is, let's say I have anxiety as well. Well, it's not just the relaxation stuff, because you still need to work out. Well, research has shown, and Dr. Amen quotes this, that people with anxiety usually have some sort of dysregulatory activity in what's called their basal ganglia. It's a part of your brain that's usually responsible for anxiety. And there's this relationship between the cerebellum, the part of your brain that coordinates movement, and the basal ganglia. And so when you do coordinative exercises, theoretically, that's going to help with your anxiety, your smooth motor control. And typically when I work with people with anxiety, they tend to be a little jumpy, or they don't have the smoothest motor control. They have trouble learning movements. So I think there's a relationship there. So what if instead we treated the anxiety from the top down, which I think is valid and necessary? CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, is very well researched and very important and very effective. But what if we did that instead of, or in combination with, coordinative exercise? Most people don't think about that. So those are some examples.
Yeah, I love this discussion. And for our audience, when I post this on YouTube, I'm going to include a link. And for everyone who's listening, I want you to Google repatterning Catherine Carrigan. There's a very simple little sequence of exercises. It takes a total of 3 minutes. Everybody's got 3 minutes. And it integrates the right and left hemispheres. So it gets both sides of your brain working. When you're stuck in the left hemisphere, you tend to be anxious. When you're stuck in the right hemisphere, you tend to be depressed. When both sides of your brain are turned on, you're smarter, you pass tests more easily, you're less stressed, you access your full brain intelligence. And I've even had people who have had strokes who have recovered more quickly from repatterning. So twice a day, repattern. I'm going to include the directions. And if you're listening, again, Google repatterning Catherine Carrigan, and you'll find videos on how to do it, as well as exercise, written articles about it. So long and the short of it, if you've got somebody, Brian, who wants to improve their brain health, what dose, how long should we exercise every day to improve our brain health?
Well, I guess the political answer would be as long as you can, or as long as you can afford. I would say the low end, 10 minutes, at the high end, 1 hour. Obviously, if you can get more, great. But we're really looking at frequency. I'm not really looking for people to force themselves to be at the gym for 2 or 3 hours, but I am looking for people to stay active on a regular basis. Now, there is some great information on when you might do that, because when you do it is also very important. And your listeners and yourself have probably heard of circadian rhythm. And there's also something that's pretty much is circadian rhythm called chronobiology. And chronobiology basically dictates when you're most likely to benefit from exercise, as well as be alert, feel happiest, do certain things like eating different meals. And so chronobiology is really important. And I typically refer to a man named Dr. Michael Bruce, who wrote this book called The Power of When. And I think you can go to thepowerofwhenquiz.com to figure out your chronotype, which then would dictate when you might do physical activity for improved brain function. And so when you find the right time to do it, the amount is typically on the low end 10 to 30 minutes, on the preferred end 30 to 60 minutes, usually moderate to vigorous, usually something around 50% to 80% of your maximum effort is usually ideal. Now, if that sounds intimidating to you, just going for a 10-minute walk, which is below 50% of your intensity, and you do that for 10 minutes, that's highly beneficial for brain function. Because remember, we talked about exercising on the high end, but we also talked about movement and activity on the other end. And movement and physical activity can be very low intensity, low impact, low commitment, and we're looking for you to sprinkle that in throughout your day. That is the idea. So if you're doing that in combination with exercise, that's usually the best thing that you could do. So if we're looking at one modality, and your listeners are saying, Ryan, I exercise 5 times a week, I go on the treadmill, I do some band work, and I do some stretches, that's my routine. I say that's wonderful that you have a routine, don't ever lose that. But what we might want to do is say 2 days a week, let's substitute that with something completely the polar opposite of what you're doing to get that variability. And so that might be where we start.
Great information. Now let's talk about cognition. Ryan, what is your definition of cognition?
Yeah, so my definition of cognition is all the mental processes associated with interacting with the world or the environment around us. And so that can include interacting with people, interacting with tasks, interacting with the environment, and they include things like planning, organization, attention, memory. And so when people feel their brain being foggy or they're not as sharp, that is a reduction in cognitive function. And I like to refer to that as executive function. Executive function are the summary of all these processes associated with focusing on doing something. There's a part of your brain called the executive network, and when you're focused on something externally, whether it's a house chore or a task at work, you're using the executive network. And so most people that come to me are looking to improve executive function, because oftentimes they find themselves, whether they have a psychological condition or they just don't feel optimal, they're usually in what's called the default mode network, which is that mind-wandering, spacey part of your brain where you feel like you want to get something done, but you're not. And you need to switch from default mode network to the executive network. And mindfulness can help you do that. Exercise can help you do that. There's a lot of things that can help you do that. But basically what I'm trying to help people do is improve what's called executive function, which is it's a category of cognition that includes memory, attention, focus, filtering out distractions, planning and organizing. And a lot of people struggle with this, especially if you're trying to be productive or accomplish something particular in your life. You probably want more executive function, and high executive function has been directly linked to socioeconomic success. And so it really does behoove people from a socioeconomic standpoint, from a psychological standpoint, and from a longevity standpoint to improve executive function. Now, a really quick way to figure out what takes away your executive function or reduces it is by stop doing the things that make you healthy or happy. Try not sleeping, you'll feel your executive function drop. Try never exercising, you'll feel your executive function drop. Try going to a job you really hate. You probably felt low executive function there. And so the idea is to get the positive end of all those things, of work environment, social environment, exercise, sleep, nutrition. Get the high end of that, and that will positively impact your executive function. And there's plenty of research done on that. And so that's how I would summarize cognition. It's your memory, your attention, your focus, your planning, organization. Everything you rely on to get stuff done every day, that is your cognition.
Now, Ryan, what are typical cognitive issues that healthy people typically have?
Nowadays, the biggest one is attention. People lack attentional resources. They don't find that they can filter out distractions, or that they get distracted easily. They can't focus on a task for longer than a few minutes at a time. Or they feel their mind buzzing, where they feel like it's activated and it's just buzzing faster and faster and faster. And sometimes these things happen and people really think something's wrong with them, like they do have a psychological condition, and they may not. They may just have reduced executive function. And it's almost like if your hip is stiff, people start to think, oh, there's something wrong with my hip, I need to get surgery. You might just need to stretch your hip or mobilize your hip or exercise, right? And so I look at cognition very much the same way. Another thing that's very common is memory. People are very worried about memory. As soon as someone's memory starts to slip, people start to feel like they're getting dementia, or they think something's wrong with them. And it can really be, what could be causing that is just too many things pulling at your attentional resources. You can't focus on the information in the moment. Therefore, if you can't focus, you can't remember. So a lot of people are struggling from that. Processing speed is very low in a lot of people that come to me. They just feel slower. They feel like they can't function fast, especially on certain tasks, so processing speed. And then emotional regulation is typically low in people with low executive function, where they get frustrated easily, or they don't feel they can maintain a positive mood for a long period of time, or they just can't initiate that task of that one thing they need to get done. These are all cognitive issues, and they can all be improved with the health interventions that I've discussed previously.
I believe the statistic now is that the average Westerner has a shorter attention than a goldfish.
Okay, I would need to do a comparative study on that.
Yeah, that's the research, that our attention span is now shorter than a goldfish. So, Ryan, what are some things that people can do with their body to improve their brain health in addition to exercise?
That's a great question. So some of the body-based interventions include sleep. Sleep is done with your body. If you're not getting optimal sleep, that is a problem. I would look into that book I mentioned earlier, The Power of When, to figure that out. I would also look at nutrition. So nutrition is something that is a body-based process. You don't eat with your brain. You don't digest with your brain. It's done in the body. But then eventually those nutrients go to the brain. And so nutrition is a key component, and that includes hydration, proper balance of micronutrients, macronutrients. What seems to be the most popular and beneficial for brain health is some sort of modified Mediterranean diet. If people have heard of the Mediterranean diet, it's pretty popular. Some other things you can do with your body are relaxation exercises. Breathing is a body first exercise. You don't breathe with your brain, you breathe with your body. So any relaxation or breathing type exercises can help with body-based brain health. And those are kind of the basic tenets. And typically that's common sense to people, but I also find it's not common practice. And so people aren't integrating all of those pillars on a regular basis, I would call those your body-based brain health foundations. And once you get those foundations squared away, you're going to feel a lot better. And then we can get more specific to very specific types of exercise, very specific nutritional interventions, very specific breathing or relaxation techniques. But if you look at your nutrition, your sleep, your breath and relaxation abilities, or stress management, we might just say, and then you look at your exercise, if you get those all squared away in a consistent manner, that will typically help brain health the most.
Now let's talk about hydration, which is how much water we drink every day. How does our hydration level affect our brain?
Well, if you want to experience that, just don't drink water and don't have the proper minerals and nutrients or electrolytes that should come with that water. And so, water content is also found in food. But if you're drinking coffee, for instance, you want to drink 2 cups of water for every cup of coffee you have. You want to make sure you maybe have a little bit of well-sourced sea salt in there for the minerals, just a little bit. You also want to make sure that the foods you're eating have some sort of water-based component. Usually vegetables and fruits have the most water content in them. And so people that are chronically dehydrated sometimes won't notice, but they'll feel this fogginess about them, maybe some fatigue. And sometimes people just forget to drink water, but water is very crucial in brain health. It's in a fluid, closed, pressurized system. And so one big component of that is fluid. If you don't have enough fluid in your brain and body, it's very hard for nerve signals to transmit efficiently and fast.
Now, and what about blood sugar? Because I know our muscles store energy, but our brain does not. How crucial is it that we maintain balanced blood sugar?
It's very crucial. Probably the biggest predictor of brain health, especially when it comes to preventable diseases, is blood sugar levels, glucose levels, basically insulin resistance and insulin levels. And so your blood sugar really does matter in terms of your brain health. And of course, that's very well modulated by diet and exercise. More specifically and immediately by diet, although immediately upon exercise, your blood sugar also can regulate or change. And so if you seek to regulate insulin or glucose blood sugar levels, you will actually be regulating brain function and brain health. And so there are certain optimal levels for certain outcomes. It's probably another podcast worth of information, but if you're looking to regulate blood sugar, you're also impacting your brain health.
Now, what happens to our brain, Ryan, when our blood sugar is too low? For example, some people go on a starvation diet. They think, oh, I'm going to lose weight and I'll just stop eating. So what does that do to your brain?
Yeah, it does depend on the individual and the type of state that they're actually in at the time, because the states can be transient. Some people doing things like intermittent fasting can find actually a cognitive boost, boosting the executive function. And so it's not a bad thing, but also people that are, if you're on a starvation diet, obviously that's probably not the healthiest thing, but typically you go through a process called gluconeogenesis, where you start converting proteins in your body into glucose because your brain needs glucose and it will do anything to get that glucose. So even if you're not eating, it'll keep producing glucose through different metabolic processes that eventually get converted to glucose, because your brain needs about 40% of that to function. And so it will do anything to do that. So typically, if you're on that type of diet, you'll be digesting your body's proteins through gluconeogenesis to get that glucose to the brain.
And what about high blood sugar? What happens to our brain if we are insulin resistant or our blood sugar tends to be too high?
Right. Well, some people can experience different symptoms, which can include brain fogginess, slower processing speed, maybe hyperactivity, or maybe just the burnout type of feeling. And so what's happening to the brain is it's having more glucose than it knows what to do with, and it can start to send signals to the body to change the hormones that are released, usually leptin, ghrelin, stuff like that, where it's burning that energy quickly and it's saying you might need more energy. So too much of a high blood sugar level might actually feel like sometimes you have a low blood sugar level, but it can negatively impact the brain. And typically that's where a lot of these dementia-based and preventable degenerative diseases are coming from, is high blood sugar.
Yeah, so basically we've got to keep our blood sugar balanced to keep our brain healthy.
It's a huge component, yes.
And I know one of my best nicknames for sugar is baby crack.
Baby crack, that's good.
Baby crack. Because we've all had that experience of maybe you have too much sugar or you have coffee with sugar in it and you just feel like you want to run around the block and you're hyperactive and so on. So,
That's right.
yeah. Now, what are some better things that people can do with their mind to improve their brain health?
Yeah, I think the mind is a very popular topic, and I wouldn't say I'm an expert, but the general things like having a growth mindset, and basically looking at having some sort of mental tools. And by mental tools, I mean things like cognitive reframing strategies. And a lot of people have heard of general reframing strategies through popular media, and they may adopt those. And so some cognitive reframing strategies might include cognitive restructuring, which is taught by cognitive behavioral therapists, where you take a thought and then you start to reframe the meaning of that thought and then the power that thought has. People can look at doing work with the belief systems. I think the best thing people can do is meditation and mindfulness without getting too psychological and those different interventions, which are extremely valuable. Mindfulness is free, it's low cost, it can be easy to integrate. And even if you're not meditating, you can still benefit from mindfulness. So earlier we talked about that default mode network. And we can either go to the executive network, which is that you're focused on a task or something external to your brain and body. And then you can also focus on the task positive network. And the task positive network in your brain is associated with mindfulness. And you can do this just by, while you're driving, while you're walking, being aware of your sensations, being aware of your breath. These are cues that are associated with mindfulness and meditation activities, but you don't have to meditate or be mindful to get those. And you can still benefit in a lot of ways just by focusing on, the smell of something, the feeling of something, the air, your breath, the bottoms of your feet, the back of your back touching the back of your chair, whatever it could be, to get your brain from default mode network to task positive network. And that can be very beneficial as well.
And I want to give it a shout out. There is a free app called Insight Timer, and you can download it onto your smartphone. They have nearly 7,000 free guided meditations of every possible length. Wonderful tool. Now, Ryan, what are some of the things that people can do with their environment to improve their brain health?
Yeah, well, there's different types of environments. There is the work environment, there's the home environment, and that would include your bedroom environment. It would also include exposure to environments you're not getting exposure to, like to nature. And so basically what we want to do is look for what's called environmental variability, where if you're in one environment all the time, this is typically where less than optimal psychology and cognition comes from. And so switching up your environment, whether it's a different workspace, going outside, taking a break, switching from being alone to being with someone and having more of a social environment, as well as, adjusting your bedroom so that you have optimal light. It's efficient for sleep and getting ready for sleep. It's also efficient for your waking. And so looking at all these different factors, it could be ergonomic factors, it could be your environment could be your cabinet or your fridge, and you want to change that environment. And sometimes your environment can be detrimental. Maybe it's the work environment, and the thing about the work environment is that it's very stressful. And maybe it's coming from a certain individual. Well, I might not be the person to help you with that, but we might identify that as the main disruptor in your cognitive or brain health. And so you would want to address that. It could be a relationship that you're not having a lot of success with. And so you would want to address that as well. And we hear this all the time when people get rid of toxic relationships or relationships that aren't conducive for their happiness, they feel a lot better mentally, psychologically, and cognitively. And so that's what I mean by environment. And so if we make an environmental modification, or we're actually getting out of a negative environment or getting into a positive environment, that's what I mean.
And finally, Ryan, what are the main predictors of brain health throughout our lifespan?
It's a great question, because people ultimately want to know, does this contribute to me living longer? And there's quite a few. The top three that I will say is continued learning, continued physical and regular physical activity and exercise, and social activity, social contact. Being sedentary, being lonely, and being stagnant in your learning processes and your cognitive stimulation is the fastest way to decline your brain health. Nutrition's probably up there. It's definitely up there, but I wouldn't say it's, it's actionable. So it's hard to say top 1, 2, 3, 4. It's all just kind of in this one bucket. It's learning, social activity, nutrition, and physical activity. Kind of the physical, or rather the cognitive and brain health foundations that I mentioned earlier. those are also the predictors of lifelong brain health and longevity in general.
So Ryan Glatt, brain health coach, any final thoughts for our audience?
I would just say don't overthink everything we've gone over today, pun intended. I would just say pick one thing that you think is going to have the biggest impact on your brain health based on your body, based on your brain, based on your environment. Pick that one thing, work on it, and see over the course of 2 to 4 weeks how it truly impacts your brain health. And I think you'll find a lot of success.
You've been listening to Ryan Glatt, brain health coach. You can find out more about Ryan and his work at ryanglatt.com and somatic.co. This is Catherine Carrigan, host of the Natural Healing Show. You can find out more about me and my work at catherinecarrigan.com and unlimitedenergynow.com. While you're there, sign up for my newsletter so you can learn even more about how you can be healthy naturally. And remember, when you take care of your brain, you take care of your entire health. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you next time.